Well, good morning again, Brother Chad Long, Delhi Baptist Church. Yesterday, I chased a few rabbits, for which I apologize, but I think they were important rabbits to catch, or maybe try to better illustrate anyway. But the overall theme yesterday was unity, and especially in the church. And I know that that's something that is talked about a lot in the Bible, and there's a reason for it, especially when you talk about the body and how it's unified together. Today's theme, however, will begin and end with truth. And truth is how we get to that unity. I remember explaining yesterday that one of the ways that I found my way into the way that I now believe was by looking for the truth. First, I was looking for a group where I fit in. I was looking for where I felt good, for where I felt welcome. I always forget to turn that off. There was a number of things that I was looking for, but what grounded me, what put me where I'm supposed to be, was the truth. Now, I'm not going to reread verse 14 because I think that you guys can understand it just fine. But I do want to, as we move into verse 15 where we left off, I do want to remind you that the point was that we grow up. Okay, we can't be kids. I think it was Vernon McGee who said he wouldn't send his kids to Vegas and trust them to be able to make good decisions there, and he wouldn't put one of his kids or grandkids in an airplane because there's just certain things kids are not good for. I mean, it takes the faith of a child to trust God, but it takes learning and studying and growing in order to be a mature adult to serve God faithfully and come to know Him the way we're supposed to know Him. So verse 15 says, "But speaking the truth in love may grow up into Him in all things, which is the head of even Christ." Verse 14 talks about how we need to not be tossed to and fro and not be like children, not to be carried off by every wind of doctrine, slide them in. I mean, it talks about how we're not to be that way. Verse 15 solidifies how we are to be in the truth and how we're to speak the truth in love, so that when we grow up, and we should grow up in Christ, so that when we grow up, we grow up in Him, understanding that He is the head of all things. He is the one that our faith and trust is in. Verse 16, "From whom," and it's talking about Jesus, that's who it's from whom the whole body, fitly joined together," there's unity again, but watch this, fitly joined together, when things are they begin in truth and everything fits like it's supposed to fit, and the body is like a well-oiled machine. It's like you at your healthiest. I mean, when the body's working that way and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, there's another reference to gifts. When every joint, every portion of the body is doing what it's supposed to be doing and supplying its part by the power of the Lord, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, making increase of the body under the edifying of itself in love. This is a reference. Every joint supplying, and supplying according to the effectual working, is a picture of the things that the Lord does in us when we are in tune with Him and following after the truth. It wasn't until I came to the truth of some of the doctrinal things I believed that I began to be useful. Let me say this again. It doesn't take necessarily grown-up Christians to fill a church. You can fill a church with a bunch of baby Christians. You can get them in there that way. But they don't become effectual. They don't become contributors. They don't become helpful until they understand what they believe and how best to share that. If you come upon a baby Christian, somebody saved within, say, the last 3 years that hasn't really been to church a lot, they're not going to know where they stand doctrinally, therefore they cannot teach what they do not know. You have to understand where you stand. You have to understand what it is that you believe, so you can then take and teach it to someone else. And this is why it's so important to know what you believe and to study these truths for yourself. Not to take what I tell you and run with it, not to take what anyone tells you and run with it, but to hear it and to study into it for yourself and find what you believe. And you know, if we're all looking for the truth, and there's only one truth, we're all going to find the same thing. The people who err are the ones who are looking for a feeling, or they're looking for various things besides the truth. And what's sad is they think they're looking for the truth too. They're looking for the truth mixed with how they feel or what they want it to say. One of the biggest things I run into when I try to tell people the truth is if it doesn't fit what they want to hear, they'll reject it out of hand. Or they'll accept only the portions of it that fit what they want to believe. It's just like what we see in the current political crisis. If it doesn't fit the narrative, it's not reported. And the narrative always seems to be something besides actual truth. And I'm not stabbing at a political party. I'm saying the whole thing is that way. The whole setup is that way. If it doesn't fit a particular narrative that you're trying to bring across, well, but I'm not going to get on politics. I'm just saying everything works that way. You got to find the truth, and you got to trust the Lord to do it. And when you find it, you can fit in somewhere. You can join up with a body, and you guys can do some good. You can. The effectual working he's talking about is the spreading of the gospel. That's what effectual working always leads to anyway. The spreading of the gospel, and not just seeing people get saved, but the teaching of the truths of the doctrine. If you remember what Paul told Timothy about doctrine and about teaching, and anyway, that's what Scripture is good for. All Scripture is given for those things. There's 4 things listed that it's given for. I won't go there now. We'll study those letters another time. But here he's just talking about how everybody's supplying, and the effectual working is in the measure of every part, and making increase of the body under the edifying of itself in love. This is talking about growth and strengthening of the body. This whole verse is talking about what every church ought to be doing if they're a scriptural New Testament church founded in truth and love of Christ. It's what we all ought to be doing. Making increase of the body under the edifying of itself in love. And that love part's important too. I know we're talking about truth today, but don't forget the love part of that. But anyway, working in every measure of every part, making increase, growing. That's what that means, making increase. Edifying, building. Building and strengthening. Edifying has 2 meanings. It means to build, but it means to strengthen as well. Verse 17, this I say therefore. Therefore, anytime you see, especially in the New Testament, but anytime you see it, back up and see what it's there for. And it's therefore, to reference verse 16, this I say then, and testify in the Lord that you henceforth, again, henceforth means from now on, walk not as other Gentiles walk in the vanity of their mind. You guys may be Gentiles there at Ephesus, but don't walk like other Gentiles. There's got to be something different about you. This is one of the things that draws people to the Lord. Some people, that's where they see Jesus is in us. That's how they come to know that that's what they want and what they need, is by watching us, by getting to know us, by seeing how we do these things. They learn how they ought to do. So he says, don't walk like them. Don't act like them. I'll reread verse 17. Therefore, this I say therefore, and testify in the Lord. This is not from me, Paul. This is from the Lord. You don't walk like they walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. The people who don't know Jesus and don't act like they want to, they're blind in their heart. They can't see the truth. And it's sad, but most of the people in the political world, spiritual world, physical world, most of the people who don't know the truth are completely ignorant of it. They think they do. That's the craziest part about it. You can take some of these politicians and talk to them. They'll talk at great length, ad nauseum, about truth that they don't even have, and they don't realize they don't have it. There's just a complete blindness and ignorance of the truth if you don't know where to look for it to begin with. This is why it's so important that people look to God. I'm a firm believer that anybody who truly looks for the Lord will find Him. They will find Him. In fact, you don't have to find Him. He finds us. We're the ones that are lost. The Lord finds us. He puts people on our path, and He tries His best to pull us out of the miry clay, so to speak, to pull us out of the woods where we're lost. The problem is that when we don't accept it a number of times, sometimes he quits coming after us. And that's a scary thing. It's just a scary thing to think about people who will miss heaven because they rejected those that were sent to catch them, to get them, to share with them. And there comes a point where nobody's looking for them anymore. It reminds me of some of these stories you hear in the news, and there's too many to name one in particular, but some missing person will just disappear. And search parties en masse will go out looking for these folks, usually, especially if it's a child. But even when it's a grown person, and there will be these huge search parties. And typically, a lot of time will pass until they either find the person or they give up all hope. The same is true in a spiritual sense in Christianity. The Lord will send out His people. And unfortunately, some of them don't go. Some of us are not soul winners, and we're all supposed to be. But the Lord will send us out. And when we're doing it right, we'll go out en masse. Jesus sent out His 12, but He also sent out 70 in the book of Luke. The Lord will send us out en masse to find those lost souls. And one of two things will happen. Either A, they'll keep searching until they find it. Sometimes they give up altogether. They just, after a period of time, they don't find those lost folks, and they give up altogether. Well, in a spiritual sense, we're supposed to keep looking until we find souls to save. We're not ever supposed to give up or quit. But in a physical sense, in a worldly sense, eventually they'll give up looking, and they'll go back to their lives, and they won't look anymore for that person. It's over. And it's a sad thing when that happens. Those who he's comparing them to, these Gentiles, he's telling them not to be like, their understanding's been darkened, and they've been alienated from a life of God through the ignorance that's in them because of their own blindness. And we are all blind starting out. It's the Lord who shines light into our eyes and tries to help us to see. And you can only hope that people will accept that. He says in verse 19, who being past feeling. This verse impacted me this morning. We're going to end in verse 22 talking about the truth again, but verse 19 impacted me. Because when I read it, several things came to mind, and maybe it did in yours too. I'll read it first. He says, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness to work all uncleanness with greediness. First, I'm going to tell a quick little story. The first time I ever saw the word lascivious, I've never forgotten it because of the way that it was worded. And it wasn't in the Bible. When I was in school, teachers still read to their students, and sometimes we would take turns reading, depending on what age group we were in. I could not tell you which class it was. I think it was Mrs. Y's class in Gifted and Talented, which I was fortunate enough to be in because somebody thought I was gifted. Poor lost souls. Anyway, no, but seriously, whichever class it was, it may have been an English class or a literature class, but I think it was Mrs. Y's class. We read a book about a guy named Johnny Tremaine, and that may have been the title of the book, Johnny Tremaine. It may not have, I don't know. But in the book, one of his little sisters, or at least a girl he treated like a sister, I don't remember, but she's being overly sexual. And this book was written about the time that America won its independence. In fact, part of the story is about the battle for independence. I won't get into that. And about how they weren't supposed to work on Sunday and how we were based on a Christian nation. But this one little girl is dressing a little provocatively, and when someone tries to correct her for the way she's dressing and acting, it wasn't just her clothes. It was the way she was carrying herself and the things she was saying. It was her whole attitude. She was being a little too provocative and promiscuous. And when something was said to her about it, she smarted off and says, I'm too young to be lascivious. Meaning, at her age, it wasn't an issue because she wasn't old enough to be sexually inclined. And that's where I learned the word lascivious. The first time I ever saw it, she smarted off. By the way, Johnny Tremaine rears back and slaps her for it when she says it because it was just a stupid thing to say. And I may be remembering wrong. It may have been the girl's mother. Somebody in the story slapped her, and I remembered that. I'm 41 years old. Read that when I was in my early teens. I never forgot it. So anyway, I didn't mean to go off on that rabbit trail either. But every time I read that word lascivious, I remember where I learned it from, and I learned it from context clues. I don't think I've ever pulled it up in Webster's dictionary. I just haven't. So feel free to do that. You'll get a better understanding than I have of the word. But I always tie it to seductiveness, sexuality, and sensuality. Just using context clues. And what I've told you, you can figure out what he's saying here. So verse 19. First it says, who being past feeling. That's where we're at in this country today. When people can do the vile things they do to each other and feel nothing. That's a scary thing. And that's why this verse hit me so hard. But it's not a new thing. Men stood and tortured our Savior, who had done nothing, and they obviously had no remorse. I mean, when you can watch somebody suffer and feel nothing, no compassion, no human decency. I can tell you, even if they were having a hanging, and you know that used to be common in this country, they would hang people for their crimes. Even at a hanging, I would have some sympathy. Even at the vilest criminal being hung, especially if he squirmed very long, I'd have some sympathy. I don't want to watch anybody die. There were people who would gather and watch this. They say that was a cruel and unusual punishment. I think the cruel and unusual part was people watching that in fascination. But I digress. He says, being past feeling, have given themselves over unto lasciviousness. When they stopped feeling any kind of morality, they turned over to sexuality. And that's what I get out of that. To work all uncleanness with greediness. Now he mentions a whole lot of sin in that one verse. No morality, a sexuality and sensuality, uncleanness, which can be a number of things, but you get the point. It's just sin. With greediness. Meaning not only do they do these things, they don't get enough of it. Now that's a convicting thought in and of itself. Let me move on. Verse 20, but you have not so learned Christ. In other words, there ought to be a difference. There ought to be a distinction between you and these other Gentiles. And let me tell you this, Christian, because you need to hear it. If there's no difference between you and the rest of the world, then we are doing all of this wrong. There's got to, not only are we saved and the lost people are not, we ought to act like it. There's got to be a difference, a distinction. One of the reasons I don't want to change the church into a bar or a concert or whatever to try to get people to come in so they feel more comfortable or whatever. I mean, I guess we could serve drinks at the door and people could come in and enjoy themselves and have a good old time in church. And there's people who probably say, well, at least they're in church. At least they're worshiping God. But that's a stupid way to look at it. There's got to be a distinction. There's got to be a difference. If not, what are you bringing them out of, and why would they want to come? Why would they want to be any part of us if we're just like everywhere else you go? Maybe I shouldn't say stupid, because there may be somebody watching this who believes that way, and I'm not trying to call anybody stupid. What I'm trying to say is it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense to turn everything we do into worldliness just to try to get a few more to come. There's got to be a difference. There's got to be a distinction. And Paul tells them here, you didn't learn Christ this way, and we shouldn't be that way. He says, if so be that you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus. In other words, you're either saved or you're not. You're either saved or you're not. And if you're saved, you weren't taught like this. This is not who you are on the inside. You've got the Spirit of God in you. And I'm going to say this, and if it makes somebody mad, it makes somebody mad. There's a bar down the road from our church that has set up a church in the same building but at different hours. Now, while they're having church, as far as I know, they're not there drinking and carrying on. And thank God for that. And if that's the only place they can meet and have church, God help them. I'm not going to judge them. But it ought to bother them. It ought to bother them, at least to some degree, that the same place where they're standing and trying to honor God, somebody else was standing and dishonoring God. You remember what James said about our mouths? He said, out of the same mouth cometh blessing and cursing. These things ought not so to be. This mouth is not designed to bless and curse God out of the same hole. And so we got to do one or the other. And the same is true with where we worship God. It ought to be done right, even though we're full of sin and we can't be perfect. I'm not trying to judge anyone. Look, they can do what they want to do. That's between them and God. What I'm saying is we're not going to do those things. We're going to set aside, we have a set aside place where we worship God. We're going to keep wickedness out of there. You don't want to act wicked, you go somewhere down the road and do it. We're going to honor God in that place. And we're going to try to serve God in that place. And we're going to learn the truth, the doctrinal truth. And then like verse 21 says, we're going to be reminded that that's what we've been taught. Because the truth is in Jesus and Jesus is in us. I hope you'll take what I've told you today and reflect on it. I hope it'll help you. And I do hope you have a good day. God bless you.